from both the living and the dead. A man reduced to a single instinct. Survive.
It is by my hand! You will rise from the ashes of this world!
We are not things! We are not things!
Where is she taking them? I want them back! They're my property!
Oh, what a day! What a lovely day!
Want to get through this?
Let's go!
As the world fell, each of us in our own way was broken. It was hard to know who was more crazy. Me or everyone else.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Graphic Festival, the Opera House's annual festival of comics, animation, illustration, and music. My name's Ben Marshall. I'm moderating the conversation today. I'm head of contemporary music at the Opera House and the co-curator of the Graphic Festival along with Jordan Vazar. We're particularly thrilled to have this Mad Max event in the program this year. Mad Max obviously became part of modern mythology from the moment the first film was released. And now Mad Max Fury Road has taken things completely to another level. It's re-entered the cultural bloodstream in a particularly virulent way. And it has got an incredibly intimate link to graphic this year, this idea of visual storytelling. George Miller has a long love and vocal love of comics and the graphic storytelling form. Brendan McCarthy is a very highly regarded graphic novelist in his own right. And obviously, Nico Lathouris has extended and deepened the story of Fury Road through the subsequently published comics. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the script for Mad Max Fury Road also originally consisted of 3,500 storyboard panels, essentially one enormous comic. It is a modern masterpiece. It's just been voted the Film of the Year by the world's international film critics, and George has just returned from the San Sebastian Film Festival to accept that award. Before I welcome Fury Road's co-writers to the stage, I want to quickly point out some of the submerged ideas in the iceberg in this script. On its surface, it's a there and back again chase scene, which it is, but there is so much more underneath, and I just wanted to quickly list a few ideas this film explores. Mad Max has always been about man versus the world, nuclear war, post-apocalypse. This film adds the idea of environmental ruin and explicitly asks who killed the world. It explores the idea of people as property, the wives, Max as a blood bag, the war boys are cannon fodder, the mothers being milked for their breast milk, Furiosa taken as a child. The film has deep self-evident currents of humanism and feminism that have been much remarked upon. It features huddled masses, grotesque inequality, and class issues. It explores the relationship of the young versus the old, Immortan Joe and the Vuvolini, war pups' wives. It's very interested in the power of story and myth. Immortan Joe controls people through the narrative he sets out, and the final quote at the end of the film makes you feel like the entire telling of Fury Road is a story by some later people reflecting on ancient history. It explores the permanence of ritual and quasi-religiosity, right down to the talismanic steering wheels. The film is infused with an incredibly surreal, phantasmagorical sense of insanity while maintaining a feeling of real internal logic. Max's single-word survival is contrasted with Furiosa's redemption. There is a strong theme of healing from the seeds, the blood transfusions, the mother's milk. The film explores going forwards to a medieval past. George Miller's talked a lot about the idea of cinema as collective dreaming, public dreams shared collectively in theatres. It's the distilled joy of the pure kinetics of cinema and has an amazing range of symbolism. Freud's idea of teeth as power, Immortan Joe's mask, Max's muzzle, the war boy's chroming. Immortan Joe doesn't die till the teeth are ripped off. It's a very dense film. And this is in a film where the titular character has maybe 14 lines, or is it 14 words? It's an incredible achievement. Let's welcome to the stage the co-writers of this remarkable film, Mr. George Miller, Brendan McCarthy, and Nico Lathouris.
I think you're in this one too. Yeah. I think you're in this one too. Yeah.
Thanks, Ben.
George Miller possibly needs no introduction, the co-writer and director of Fury Road, one of the world's great filmmakers, an Oscar winner, creator of Mad Max, and a visionary. George, welcome.
Thanks very much, Ben. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Brendan McCarthy, co-writer and concept artist of Fury Road, an incredibly gifted artist and designer who's applied his unique and influential sensibility to graphic storytelling and film for over 30 years. Brendan, welcome.
Cheers, thanks, Ben.
Nico Lathouris, co-writer and dramaturge on Fury Road, an immensely highly regarded dramaturge, and he will hate me for saying this, but you may also recognize him as the grease rat mechanic in the very first Mad Max. Nico, welcome. It's a genuine honor to have you all here. Thank you very much for taking part. Before we get into it, Nico, you've spent a lot of time working on the imagery that's going to be scrolling behind us. Can you please explain the what wallpaper we'll be looking at?
We're regarding the imagery you'll see as wallpaper. It has no relevance to, well, it has relevance, but there's no serendipity or synchronicity between what we might be talking about and what is up there on the screen. But let me explain. They're in sections. The sections are named, and the general sense of it goes from concept art through the storyboard, through sometimes photographs, and then to film. So that's the general feel of it. In between the sections, you'll see some pages of storyboards. Those storyboards are early storyboards. They were Brendan's storyboards, I believe, for a pitch, an early pitch. They're not the storyboards that the 3,500 storyboards from which the movie was made. And I think that's all I need to say about it.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Now, George, I would love for you to give some exposition of the timing and involvement of Brendan and Nico. They're all three accredited, all three of you are credited as co-writers of Fury Road. And I believe most members of the audience and myself, until we started getting into it, assumed the three of you sat in a room, finished off a script and handed it up to be delivered. Whereas I realised on Friday that Brendan, it's been 12 years since he was at Kennedy Miller Studios, and you haven't, until this event, sat in a room together to go over the story and ask questions of one another.
Well, I think best to begin by saying my favourite saying by far from John Lennon was, "Life is what happens when you're making other plans." And the way the three of us came together, in a way, not together, but came to put our efforts into what was ultimately Mad Max Fury Road, was never planned in any formal way. It just happened. And it's certainly not textbook. But, Brendan, probably the best thing is to ask you, Brendan, how did you come to be involved? Because it's never happened to me before in the way that you actually came to be involved in the project.
With Mad Max, I had come to Australia when I was a young guy and wandered into a cinema on a sunny afternoon to see Mad Max 2. Thought, oh, I'll watch that, yeah, why not? And walked out shaking, thinking, what on earth have I just seen? Bought another ticket, walked back into the cinema, and then proceeded to watch the movie 20 times over the next few weeks. The effect of Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, on me was very profound. I mean, people like John Lennon talk about, when I first heard Elvis, it blew my mind, that stuff. Well, so there was something about this Road Warrior film that it turned me upside down. I couldn't work out how could a film have completely grabbed me and taken me into itself so much and just turned me around. And so I wanted to somehow meet the people who did it. And as I was in Australia at the time, I did eventually sort of meet a lot of people, except for George. I met Terry Hayes, I met Byron Kennedy, people like that, Brian Hannant. And so every now and then I'd send George a letter about Mad Max or something. So he probably thought, crazy fan or something, I don't know. But 15 years later, I did a TV series and wrote an episode which was a pastiche of Mad Max and sent it to George with a little note on it saying, whatever happened to Mad Max, ? This was about a decade after Thunderdome. And lo and behold, the phone rang a couple of months later. It was Doug, who's George's producing partner, saying, we're going to be in LA next week. Do you want to talk? We're thinking about doing a project and we'd like to talk to you about some art. And so I came along and chatted to George about the Mad Max films, thinking, I've got to put it into his head that there's loads of people who would love to revisit that Mad Max world again. That was kind of part of what I wanted to do. And I had not knowing and having any idea that one day I might actually end up writing the thing so I could see and return to the Mad Max world. So it was a very strange, circuitous route to actually get to see another Mad Max movie.
And first thing, what you didn't say is that somewhere along that story, you sent me about 3 pages of drawings of images that somehow you conjured from the movie, even characters and things that were never really in the from the world, but not ultimately in the movie, and they blew me away. So it wasn't as though we suddenly said, "Oh, this guy's interested in Mad Max. Let's bring him in and see what we can do together." It was those drawings and your particular vision, which I realise you just see in all your work, were just striking. And there's some fantastic artists out there. And one of the great joys of Mad Max Fury Road was to see all the art that it generated. But I can still remember the drawings that you had done at those days.
And what year did you decide to sit down with Brendan and go, right, I'm engaging you now to begin work on what I hope will be the next Mad Max film?
97.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
It's last millennium, and Yeah.
Crazy.
And when did you finish up your contribution?
I worked on Mad Max for 2 years. You know, really the bit that I like doing the most is the early bit where, you know, you just kind of, the thing hasn't become what it is yet, because once it settles and structures, loads of ideas have to be got rid of because they don't fit. But there's a period before that where it hasn't locked itself down as a story totally. And so you don't know whether this character's going to make it or not, or this scene. And I like that period a lot, actually. It's very kind of amorphous and creative time.
And George, when...
Sorry, one thing, it wasn't until Brendan, who just recently got back into the country, that I was able to tell Brendan a little story, which is a slightly negative story, but we were also working, when we decided to work together, with a writer who's not Australian and well-credentialed, very impressive in the room. And we said, let's try it for a month or two, the three of us working together, it may not work, and so on. And he was writing, and the work was very, obvious and superficial, and he was writing Max as if he was Arnie Schwarzenegger and saying cute action hero lines or whatever, without really digging down deep into what we were trying to do. And because you can't start a story on the surface, you dig down deep. Anyway, at a certain point, Brendan and I were working, and then I bounce across and look at the material that's coming out from this writer, and it was really bad. And I told him, look, it's just not working, it's not working. And he said, well, I think it works, you know. And I said, well, Brendan agrees with me. And he said, and I'm sorry for the swear word, but he said, what the fuck would he know? He's just a cartoonist. And
how wrong he was.
A guillotine dropped, and Brendan and I worked for the next 2 years together, and we brought into the fold Peter Pound and Mark Sexton. Yeah. And seriously, in many ways, it was the time of our lives. I'll just say one thing, and then I'll stop about that. One day, here we were building this, we called it the Mad Max room, building this storyboard around the room, everyone drawing. I mean, I was one of those kids growing up in Queensland where comics were illicit. We weren't, you know, we just weren't allowed to do them. My parents thought we were all a little bit somehow, you know, not particularly smart because of it. But drawing with people and sitting in a room, and it occurred to me one day that the four of us grew up in isolated communities. The four of us spent our lives, our childhoods in the imaginative life. You from a remote village in Ireland, Peter Pound from Western New South Wales, me from Western Queensland, and Mark from Norfolk Island.
It worked beautifully. So 1997 to 1999, beginning of 2000, what happened with the Mad Max work that you created with Brendan, Mark and Peter at that point? When did Nico start to become involved?
Well, you know, it is crazy, but this film was greenlit 3 times by 3 different studios. And it would fall down, and we'd go on to another movie, and then it would get up again, and it would fall down with a different cast. But it was a film you really couldn't kill with a stick. And I have to, you know, we call Doug Mitchell, my producing partner, the honey badger. If you know about the honey badger, he won't let go. He looks like a honey badger. He won't let go. But it was a film you couldn't somehow kept on forcing itself on us, and so we ended up making it. But the first time it fell down, Brendan and I, we also worked on another script, and then Brendan went off. I went on to Happy Feet, which it took a long time, and and then we revisited it. And by then, Nico and I, who've known each other for so long, actually, we went to school together. But it wasn't really until you went to NIDA that I got to know you well. And then Nico I began to hear of the work that Nico was doing as an actor and a dramaturge, particularly highly influential in Australian television, having been very influential in theatre, about the process of the actor. And to cut a long story short, it really occurred to me that the process that the actor goes through, particularly in the theatre, and the dramaturgy of all of that, and the process that the screenwriter goes through are virtually parallel or overlap in the Venn diagram so much. And except they use slightly different language. So often I've had my most successful collaborations with actors, Nick Enright on Lorenzo Zoil, Michael Christopher on Witches of Eastwick, even though that was entirely his screenplay. They know what it's like to be in front of an audience live and responding moment to moment to the rhythms and the feedback that's sort of happening. So I asked Nico to get involved.
Yeah, it was in 2002. So I was very fortunate that I received the legacy of 3,500 storyboards already done and a script. So I came in at a point when that was all there. And I looked at it and thought, oh my God, what am I going to do with this? You know, it's just like this crazy, mad action, wall-to-wall action. How can what am I doing here? So I had to I worked by myself for probably about 10 months before I actually really started engaging with George at a very intimate level. But during that time, I decided I had to find a way of understanding this totality bit by bit. So I laid out a huge sheet of paper and drew a timeline and began looking at the different things that were going on in the script and putting them down where they were happening, and noting that there were 120 deaths, and this is where Splendid falls off the war rig, and it finally came out to be about 22 sections, and I thought, 22. I wonder what that means. I also did know that this was not a story about somebody surviving by vanquishing 122 enemy. I knew that it was a story about a man who, well, there's two ways of looking at it. One was that it was a man who was going from being alone to being belonging. It was about a man running away from his better self, whose better self catches up to him. It was about a man who starts off as a wounded animal and ends up as a highly socialized human being capable of love. So I had these tools to work with, and I found in Jung this idea of individuation. And individuation accounted for the process of a human being starting as a wounded animal and becoming a fully socialized, fulfilled human being, self-realized. And I looked further and looked for the number 22. And I found that number 22 in the Hebrew alphabet, and I found the number 22 in the 22 paths of the tree of life of the Kabbalah, and which also correlated with the 22 cards of the major arcana in the Tarot. So I used this model as a map by which to understand and to calibrate the journey of this man through the chase, or through the race, through the chase and the race back. And that took me about 10 months to do all that work. And then I felt I was able to meet you and talk to you and have some understanding of the work. And I mean, after the next 12 years, I mean, we got more into interrogating the script, and really the real interrogation started when we got to Africa and had to really look at the engine that was driving this incredible beast.
You know, a lot happens once you start the physical production, but
Absolutely.
we kept on revisiting it and so on. Yep. I didn't know you were using numerology to make this film.
And at the other end of the spectrum, Brendan, you talked about, you know, you'd seen your role as bringing a little bit of punk rock energy and sort of pulling George from the Babe, Happy Feet world back to this sort of electrical feeling you had coming out of Mad Max 2.
Yeah. In a sense, I was... after Road Warrior, Thunderdome was great, but I felt a bit disappointed, and I felt that it didn't quite do what I was hoping for. And I thought, another Mad Max film has to kind of recapitulate Mad Max 2 and move it on further. And I felt very much that was the energy I was looking for in a Mad Max film. And if George calls me the sort of the guardian of Mad Max in a way, I would be his radar for stuff. So, there would be certain ideas, they weren't right for Mad Max. They might be good ideas, but somehow they weren't the right energy,
But it's important to remember that we sat and talked about the movie a lot and actually wrote a prose version of the story before we started the storyboards. We knew basically where it was going to be going. And Brendan was like, I don't know, if when you work together, there's a kind of fraternity or that happens, a collegial approach, and you were sort of the wild brother who was telling me, the way you said it the other day was plug in the amps and start playing a bit of rock and roll, and whatever you do not disappoint me, George. You said that from the very beginning. I'm here to make sure that you don't disappoint me.
Yeah. Well, can you imagine if Fury Road wasn't what it is? It's fantastic. I worked on it and I was blown away by it.
And just to finish, that Nico was my quiet sort of guru brother who's taking me through. Let's just look at this much more carefully. Let's see what's happening down here. Well, so it ended up being a really strange mix. And then I had my brothers and sisters who were working in the production of the film, and then I had in post-production Margaret Seaksel, who basically echoed Brendan. She was the editor of the film and had a massive task, and she said, my main job here is to stop you embarrassing yourself.
She did in fine style. She's the other co-writer almost.
Yeah. There's a sort of, I think the essence of a Mad Max film is the sort of, there's the Joseph Campbell mythological stuff, but there's also Demolition Derby, there's that side of it as well. I remember a critic once talking about Mad Max 2 talking about the delight in destruction in the film. And I think, when a little boy has got a toy and he's going, ah! There's that element in George's work that I think I want to keep that.
Respond to. When we were talking about doing this event and discussing Fury Road, we sort of came up with George, you prompted the three main questions that motivate you for discussing story in any way, shape, or form. And I'd like to kind of pose the three questions to you all and just discuss, why do we make stories? What would the world be like without stories? And why make this story?
Well, I'll try to. A huge question. I think we could be here for such a long time and never even really get to understand it, because at the bottom of it, all great questions ultimately are about humanity and why the hell we're here, is there any purpose, and so on. I think just backing up on that, I really think in this collective endeavor we have as humankind to understand why we're here, it usually starts with a great question. And I'm not the first to say it. A lot of people argue that the greatest question ever asked, particularly in recent times, was Einstein's, which was, what would the universe look like if I rode on a beam of light? And he asked that at 14, and he answered it effectively in a real world way at 28. That was a great question, and that led to a question, another powerful question, which was, what happened before the Big Bang? Utterly unknown, and I was very happy that one of my sons asked me that after he heard about the Big Bang. And then the question, which it never occurred to me, it's not quite that order of question, but is the second question, is what would the world be like without story? Because the more you dig down into that question, the more is revealed. And Nico said that there would be no world without story.
Singularity.
And if a person, even if a person standing still takes one step, there's a beginning, middle, and end of that story. And even if they're standing utterly still, depending on your point of view, there is still a narrative. So everything has a narrative. But the key to it is that it needs an audience. It needs an observer. There is no story without somebody to observe it. You watch your cat. It carries in its DNA so much programming, so much information. Its narrative is written for it, except at least the blueprint is written, and the way that it interacts with the world it makes up its narrative. But you need an observer. The cat is not aware of its narrative. And that applies to everything. And so you end up going broader and broader on that question, and you get into the great stories, the great mythologies, the great religious traditions, the great scientific narratives, which I think ultimately are where the great hope of humankind is in this bewildering adventure. And so story is something that is deeply ingrained in us as individuals and as a collective.
I mean, you talk about it as we are hardwired for story, and it's true, we are hardwired. It's feels to me like it's a form of communication, or more than that, it's a language that by which we give to each other packages of I like to think of it as packages of meaning from which we can complete or take the next step in our very own story. In other words, I'm in the middle of a story, I'm in my own story, and I have a whole number of choices about what I do in a particular situation next. And what stories give me is that essential information, that sort of, it's like it gives me the benefit of future opportunities of the multitude of choices I can make, and I can see what the result of them are, because they do have ends.
And on the question of this story, why make Fury Road?
Just without making this too long, you've got a different theory. Do you want to get into it?
I'm a bit too jet lagged to really be coherent about it, I'll be honest with you.
Well, why make this story? It starts at a way more mundane level, and that is an idea came, and I don't know when it was. I remember where it was. I was crossing the street, and I said, "Wouldn't it be great?" Oh, it was almost a question. What would it be like, or could we make a film which is almost a continuous chase? And how much can the audience apprehend from that story in terms of character, relationship in character, the world, the backstory, and so on? And that the MacGuffin, the thing that everybody's in conflict over, should be human, because to some extent or another, we are all commodities, basically, of in the world to some extent. So what if the cargo was human? So there were 5 wives that came in the first instance, or 5 women fleeing, and they had to obviously be fleeing a tyrannical warlord, and they needed a champion who had to be a road warrior, but it couldn't be a male because that's a different story. And Max gets swept up into their problems. Max, who wants to avoid everyone else in the world, cannot help but get swept up into this chaos and to this conflict of wills. And that was the basic idea. It's a very, very simple idea, and like every other idea, it's driven, for me, that's ever come to me, it's driven first by the story or the mechanics of the story or the potential of the story, and then it's driven by an opportunity to use the evolving technology of cinema, which is evolving so rapidly. Cinema is about 120 years old, and to use the new technology, the new digital dispensation, in something that we once worked on 3 decades before.
Before we move on to the publicly submitted questions, Brendan and Nico, anything else you'd love to?
I'd like to also say that it felt to me that it's not that story, that particular story, the chase, the race, comes from somewhere else as well. And I felt very strongly, and that was because of the study of the structure of this story, that it represented a very basic need in way beyond George, that somehow he had tapped into a kind of a psychological or really deep need in the sort of zeitgeist, or in like a psychological constellation that he was representing. And so it should be, because he's working in a field that is public, and not only are your movies public, but they are of a high concept level. They're very, very out there. And so I felt that I needed to find something essential there. And I think that George has found this Mad Max thing is like, it's almost like the Oedipal thing. It's like a complex. It's like a constellation in everybody's psychology. We could talk about that for a long time, but about what that particular psychology is. But to me, it was always about, I went right back to the first movie and remembered that he lost it's about loss. It's about the response to loss. And the response to loss was Max, just like he is sitting at the beginning of Fury Road. He's sitting there looking at the plains of silence. He's sitting there, his wife is dead, his child is dead. He's a father that isn't a father. he would like to be a father, and he's got the mask, and he's got a choice of whether to grieve, but he doesn't. He doesn't grieve. He doesn't honour the dead. He projects, he sublimates that feeling into vengeance. And I feel it's got something to do with that, and so apt today. I mean, we've got the Middle East, for example. So there are a whole lot of psychological kind of elements, forces, drives inside that story that represent the world. It's an allegory, but not just an allegory of the world, political and social, but also an allegory of the world that is very psychological and deep within us. And that's why I think why.
Can I just say two quick things? Don't want to drag on, but two quick things you asked at the beginning is, why do we need stories? Very simply, for me, it's that we live in a world which there's a mass of information, and basically we use stories for survival. We're looking for signal in the noise. We basically use stories for coherence. And in many ways, we're attracted to allegory and simple stories because, as this is, I mean, I always say that this film is forward to the past. Even though we go to some post-apocalyptic future, we're basically going back to a medieval, dark age dispensation. And so the allegory is very obvious and its connection is very obvious. And so, it's no surprise that even the early Mad Maxes were described by the French as westerns on wheels, and basically had the same function as westerns. And stories ultimately are about survival. The greatest stories are they are used for survival. Classically, the first peoples of Australia, the pedagogic value of the story basically maps out your world, tells you how to survive, where the water is, where the food is, and so on and so on. And I think we do that still in the modern world. And sometimes, and dare I say a lot of times, stories can also be dangerous. And I've always been aware that we should have a little label on our stories, hazardous material. Because they can be.
We did a big call out for questions around the world to be submitted for this conversation. We were overwhelmed with responses. It was really an enormous amount we had to go through. We've selected the ones that we think can evoke some new angles for discussion around Mad Max, and we'll be asking these questions. I'll be asking these questions of the three co-writers now. To Brendan, I found Mad Max Fury Road dramatically satisfying after a single viewing, but simultaneously the film is so rich in small details that I kept finding new parallels, arcs and interrelationships even after seeing it 9 times at the cinema. Did you intend to create a film that demands to be seen more than once to appreciate it fully?
Yep.
Next question. There was a quote of Brendan's from the art book. I don't know if you've seen the art book for Mad Max. It's absolutely gorgeous. But there was a quote that he can't remember giving that George, Nico, and I really kind of hung on to, which was that Mad Max is like an epic visual poem where it's beautiful on the surface, you can enjoy it on that level, but the resonance goes much deeper. So this was in your mind from the very beginning in discussions with George.
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of core story there for me, and one of the things that happened is what we thought the story was about started to shift as we worked on it, and by the time it came to the end, you thought, oh, and it was something that George told me would happen, because I kept going and saying, George, what's the ending though? Like, we need to sort, should we not have the ending and know where we're going? And he said, no, just relax. There'll come a point when the characters will start to live, and they'll take us where they're going, if we're doing our job properly. And I wasn't familiar with it. I'd never written a Hollywood screenplay before, and I said to George, you do realise I haven't written a Hollywood screenplay before. And he says, don't worry, I have. So, so I thought, okay. But that's what happened. And, you know, to me, when I saw Fury Road for the first time as, you know, somebody in the audience watching the movie, it really struck me that it was the theme, it was like change where you're at rather than looking for the promised land. You know, that really came to me, you know, when in the end they reverse and go back to the only green place they know, which is where they were. But in the destruction of the warlord and the liberation of the wretched who join them as they go up, you know, this whole revolution that happens, suddenly that oppressive place has become the green place. And I thought that was the great message of Fury Road, is change where you're at and stop looking for a place out there, you know.
All the different ideas that this film explores, so I ran through a handful of them at the beginning here, that I had noticed and read about. Were they all consciously embedded, or do you find yourself surprised by things being revealed that you hadn't consciously placed there that come up, or it has been rigorously constructed to include all these elements?
Intuition is a method. So maybe it was all there, but there was also a rigorous attempt to orchestrate those moments and give them some kind of shape by acknowledging them, that they were there. So there was a lot of acknowledgement going on, a lot of recognition, a lot of searching for what those moments were, as you described them at the very beginning. And there are many, 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 many more. And they are there, but I think it did require us, and I think maybe that's what we saw on the screen, is that we had the time, the luxury of finding them and amplifying them and putting them into some form of orchestration, some sort of shape, whereby they had delivered some kind of meaning. Yeah.
What do you feel about that, Brendan?
Well, actually, I was looking at Knox's penis gourd, thinking,
That's right.
do you remember all that stuff? We thought, we actually can't do loads of young boys running around with giant penis gourds. That's just like, don't do it, you know.
But it's in the drawings.
I know, it's in the drawing, but it's not in the movie.
Yeah.
Because, you know, you explore stuff and then you think, actually, hang on, how's this going to go down? Don't do it.
But everything in this story had basically derived from some real-world experience, whether it was from history, an object seen somewhere. We were like magpies. The important thing about the process was to make sure that everyone involved in the design, and there were so many people, you know, from wardrobe to vehicles and so on, all work to the same design principles, which are very basically, everything is basically found objects repurposed. B, you had to be able to source whatever those objects were, indeed even language, from next Wednesday when the apocalypse begins, and so that you notice language itself is found objects repurposed, as is gesture. And C, we had this notion that just because it's the wasteland, it doesn't mean people can't make beautiful things. And because if you go to, no matter how impoverished a culture, even early Paleolithic man was able to do those beautiful rock drawings. You go to the poorest township, say in South Africa, and they'll take plastic and Coke cans and wire and fashion them into beautiful toys. And these people, to some extent, had time on their hands, and anything that survived, whether it was a steering wheel, a foot pedal, a car would to some degree be either fetishized or basically seen as a religious artifact. And that started at the very beginning of the process. The chastity belt that the women wear, I saw in Venice, in the museum in Venice, exactly, well, not exactly like that, but probably 15th century. But very, very similar to that. It was one of those brutal things I've ever seen and stuck in my mind. And the idea was, just with one image, one prop, you can tell a lot of story. You get a lot of bang for your bucks. No one has to explain.
Yep. Yeah. Well, that leads into the next question we've been submitted about the level of detail and the decisions in design. The question to you, George, is there any significance assigned to the particular choices of grey-black face paint for the War Boys?
Just that the grey, black, and with variations is basically the War Boys have some sort of neoplasm, some sort of disease going on, so they're designated half-lives, so they're going to put all their effort into dying into some warrior afterlife. So they already are fashioning themselves like skeletons. They don't tattoo themselves with living objects. They tattoo or scarify themselves with car parts, because car parts outlast them. And so if you're a war boy or a half-life, you'll paint yourself white, and you'll form some sort of skeletal look. From the original drawings, if you look at Brendan's original drawings of the War Boys, they were much more decorated, and we kept on paring it down. That was one thing I learned about this movie. As time went on, it was simplify, because it's a very spare world. You don't want to clutter, you don't want to create visual noise, and knowing that the movie was going to play so super fast that you had to make it so colours were muted. If you look at it, the brightest costume is the Doof Warriors, and so on and so on. So I haven't answered your question. What was the? Oh yeah, and then those that like Furiosa, and we call them the Imperators, were full life still. Like Max is a full life, and no one really picked it up. And one of the most gratifying things by far when you make a movie like this and goes out into the world is to get reviews and people stopping you and talking about it, and you realise, just as Brendan hoped, that people are reading a lot of iceberg under the tip. But no one picked up the fact of this half-life, full-life thing. But if you look at Furiosa, the Imperators mark themselves by putting that black on their usually shaved skulls. And if they start to get sick or whatever, then they have to paint themselves in white. And
and that's why the War Boys are half white.
That's why, they're half white.
Yeah. Just quickly as well, can you please tell the story of that reviewer, the Japanese reviewer? You're talking about the reaction that he had to the film that was so pronounced. You make stories, and you really don't know how they're going to be received. You don't. You put everything you know, all your skills and wisdoms, and you'll never master this process anyway. And you put it there, and then, as we were talking about audience earlier, you really don't know what you have. Often it takes about 5 or 10 years, if it does impinge at all, to really understand what the story meant. And that's the key to this, that all narratives have to be in the eye of the beholder. And I must say, I've never had quite a response to any film we've made as we have in this one so quickly. And a Spanish reviewer said to me something really interesting not 2 weeks ago. He said, you realize now because just rarely you talk about a film
except after the first week or so that it comes out. And he said, you realize now that this story no longer belongs to you guys, it belongs to everybody. And I said, and he's really referring to all the fan art and everything that was coming back. And I said, oh, did Joseph Campbell had a marvelous quote from the Zanzibar Swahili storytellers who would say this, when they finished a story, they'd say, the story has been told. If it was good, it belongs to everybody. If it was bad, it was my fault because I am the storyteller. And I realized that's the process. I didn't know, what a Mad Max was like until people like Brendan turned up and so on. Anyway, cut a long story short, I get very uncomfortable, or not uncomfortable, sort of feel responsible when I get stopped in the street and someone will show me their Immortan tattoo or their, Furiosa tattoo or Max tattoo or a Nux tattoo or a steering wheel tattoo. And I was in Japan doing a review and this critic, who was English speaking, said he read the movie so deeply beyond anything that I'd even thought of myself. And I thought, wow, this had such resonance with him. And I said to him, how did did you pick this up in one screening? He said, no. He said, he did exactly what you did. And I've done it with the great movies in my life, he said, no, the moment I walked out of the cinema, I asked the distributor, could I go and see it again? And then I walked out of the cinema again, and I went to a tattoo parlor, and he took me aside and showed me his shirt, and he had the Immortans logo tattooed on his chest. And I thought, oh boy, I hope this movie lasts.
I think you're safe on that front. Look, the next question this person submitted was, can you confirm or deny the existence of war girls or female war boys? And where does Furiosa fit into the war boy hierarchy?
You answer that.
I think there's only war boys.
Yep.
And Furiosa, I think George better answer that one. That's all right.
Look, I can only say what's in my mind. In my mind, there are definitely no war girls. The Furiosa has her unique story, which is very, very deep, and we worked on that story, but she is the exception, being an imperator. The important thing, but at least a very important point, is that often these allegorical, metaphorical stories they're in the eye of the beholder, and again, a quote from an great English rock star, Freddie Mercury, when asked the meaning of his songs, and when someone offered a meaning for Bohemian Rhapsody, said, if you see it, darling, it's there. And I think it's true about anything that has a poetic dimension.
It belongs to the audience now.
Sorry?
It belongs to the audience.
It belongs to the audience,
Yep.
yeah.
Nico, the next question is for you. It starts with a statement followed by a question. Okay. I'll read the statement first. I absolutely love the wife Angharad. It's clear that she was the one who incited the others to escape, and she consciously takes a stance in opposition to the Immortans' ideology, his death cult, by assuming a life-affirming position, no unnecessary killing, we are not things, the anti-seeds. I think that on an intellectual level, she's the Immortans' true opponent, and on that level, she's powerful. Her influence on the other wives survives through her words. And the question is, could you talk a little bit about the role of intellectual influence and about ideology as a tool of control and means of rebellion in this film?
Yeah. She's definitely she holds the ground that is opposing the Immortan. It's hard to speak about something like feminism because I'm not a woman. I don't know if that really matters, but in some cases it might. And there's a sense that that in this film there's a revolt. I feel it's a revolt. It's a rebellion against the kind of patriarchal sensibility, and that what she represents is really utopian. It's naive. It's hard to take seriously, but it is serious. It is really serious, and she represents I think more than anything, she represents the idea of the provision for the child. I think that the base of all this whole thing is this providing for a child, because a child is impotent in the sense that, you know, if you leave it, it's going to die. Unless you feed it, unless you look after it, it's going to just die. And the whole drive of this film is about, I think, dismantling the patriarchal system, and you see it even in the dismantling of the economy. The economy is water, you know. At the end, they open up the water and give everybody water. So she is really important, and she comes, and her death is almost dead center of the movie, and again, it represents. It's almost like a repetition compulsion for Max, who's repeating and repeating everything he's ever done. It all goes back to the death of his wife and child, and here we are again with the death of the wife and child. And so I don't know if I'm making any sense, but...
Why is she naive?
Well, no, it's seen as naive. She's not naive. It's as if it would take a lot for a bunch of men to make such a dynamic shift without very strongly considering what would happen, what upheaval it would cause us as a social and political kind of system.
But she sets out not trying to change that world. She's trying to go to a better world.
Yes, she is.
And saying, well, I'm not going to stick around here.
But in the end, she has to change it. It changes. The only way to do it is to change
by
it.
that action.
Yeah.
But her intention is not naive. That's all. You said something. You don't think she's naive?
No, I think she's sincerely wrong. That's all, you know. I mean, she sincerely believes that there's a green place, which is a recapitulation of her childhood, and she's going to take these girls to that life that she knew.
Furiosa.
Yeah. But when she gets there, there's a load of crows, and the green place is gone. So she was sincerely wrong about her belief, and she's taken those girls to a very dark fate. You know, that's the point I was making. You know, which is part of her to me, she's really tragic, you know, in what she's trying to do.
But it was still a better choice than sticking around and letting the status quo, the dominance hierarchy prevail.
And the girls won't go back.
And you can't judge that action of going out without looking at the consequences, which is that they do come back and they do find the green place, which you initially said, you know, what you're going out to find is already here. And they do cause the revolt. It's only by going out there to something that they think exists but doesn't exist that they are able to bring about the whole demise of the Immortan. So there is, even though that might be a silly thing to do, it has value in the end. Retrospectively, it was the only thing they could have done to create that change, that dynamic shift. And it was a violent one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brendan, can I ask you a question moving from sort of ideology to something slightly more primal? Just the phantasmagorical madness that completely infuses this film.
Yeah.
It feels like it strikes quite a different note to the preceding three. I've followed your work for a long time, and I can see the link up, sort of taking what exists in Mad Max world and then sort of wide-screening the madness almost. Can you talk a little bit about, because the madness isn't po-faced either, and we've chatted a little bit about this, there's a sense of its own over-the-top ludicrousness as well that keeps it very compelling.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I love about the Mad Max films, and they're my favorite kind of world, you know, I prefer the world of Mad Max to that of Star Wars or Alien or something, is I really like, there's an incredibly dark humor in Mad Max, you know, like really quite sick, but I like that. And
the boomerang in the hand.
well, you know, and also just tonally, just that, say, the film Road Warrior, Mad Max 2, you know, you've got quite a hard-to-take rape at the beginning, shot through a telescope, so it's grainy and it looks like reportage, which makes it more real. It feels real. And I remember when I first saw it going, you know, that kind of feeling, thinking, Christ, I hope those guys don't get me, you know. And then later on, you've got a guy reaching for a silver boomerang and his fingertips go off like a kind of Chuck Jones, you know, a cartoon. And there's this massive veering of tone in a film. And I'm thinking, it's the first time I'd ever really got a movie which, you know, the sort of sense of a confident swagger in it and all that kind of stuff coming off it. That's why, I mean, a lot of people have said this, but Mad Max 2 was the closest thing to rock and roll in a film that, you know, we'd really felt, you know, it was about the attitudes in it. It wasn't like, you know, an Elvis Presley rock and roll film. It really was rock and roll in the film form. And part of that is there's a lot of surrealism in George's work, which I like. And there's also a kind of, I'd call it a hyper-reality that in, you know, like how he speeds up the film. It's almost like reality isn't going fast enough for speed freaks, so let's make it go faster. There's just, let's keep cranking away and pushing it. That kind of, you know, that energy, you know, we talked about all this stuff as well. You know, I told him about, you know, these elements of Road Warrior are, you know, we can't dissipate that for Fury Road. And I've got to say, you know, from the minute that movie, Fury Road opens, and then I loved it. When the logo comes in, it goes, ka-junk. And the logo's so heavy, it goes, I thought, yeah. You know, you just go, And then remember what you felt like after you went through that whole, like, was it 40 minutes? And then there's that flare fizzles after the storm, and it just goes in a black, and you go, whoa, you know, there's that great, my God, what an opener, you know? And, I mean, just, I don't, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in pop culture stuff in Fury Road and all the Mad Max stuff, but things like, you know, like the hot rod culture, which came into Fury Road that wasn't in the others, like we made a decision to move off the dune buggy kind of thing into hot rods. And if you know the sort of hot rod guy, Big Daddy Roth, do you know you might know his stuff. He used to do those classic 60s monsters driving hot rod stuff. But when you look at images of Immortan Joe in his double caddy, you know, and it's total Big Daddy Roth stuff. You know, so all the hot rod petrol heads get all that stuff. They see it and they go, I know what those guys are doing. So, you know, it's kind of riffing all the time on all that stuff, all through the movie, you know.
And it's sort of coupled with this sense of an underlying coherence, whether you understand the logic that's underpinning it, there is a logic underpinning that complete insanity that's engulfing you.
That's the most important thing, that it had to be very rigorous, otherwise it's just noise. You know, I often talk about movies bottom line, I'm still trying to grapple with the silent cinema. It's where the language was first defined. When people first saw a close-up of a head turning in the cinema, they screamed because they thought it was a disembodied head. Now, a little kid can read a movie or moving image before they can read a book. So it's an acquired language, it's a new language, and I'm with Kevin Brownlow, who wrote So Long Ago, The Parade's Gone By. Basically, the language was defined pre-sound because sound locked down the camera, and it took a long time for the technology of the camera to allow everything to move. And now we're at a time now where the cameras are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, so there's a whole thing about that. So movies are getting faster and faster, but in this movie, well, I say all that because it is a kind of music, it's a visual music. And particularly, it starts in the writing. It certainly started in the storyboards. The problem with storyboards, they carry, well, the great thing about storyboards, they carry an enormous amount of information very, very quickly to everybody working on the film. The problem with it, sorry?
I was just going to say, just to add to that, that in the call sheets we gave out every day on shoot, the storyboards to be shot that day were included. That's how important they were.
So everyone knew who was in the screen, blah, 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 where they were sitting, the stunts and so on. The problem with storyboards is they miss what I call the fourth dimension, that's time. And when you miss time, there's no real narrative. That's probably a silly thing to say because, of course, we read books and, of course, we read graphic novels or whatever, but there is implied time in those. So, but in the way that a storyboard is constructed, it's a different thing than a graphic novel, quite a different thing. Okay, but when you get, when we started, when we wrote, and then finally you confronted with the editing room, you used exactly the same process and language that a composer uses. The great thing, and a lot of editors don't understand, there's a great thing about working with Margaret Sixel, who happens to be my wife, is she understands emphatically that there has to be a powerful causal relationship between one shot and the next to make the space, the film space, coherent. Just as a composer has a very powerful, the great composers have a powerful causal relationship, one note to the next. Chord progression, tempo, tonality, melody, line, all of that almost gets to a mathematical level. And so you can't, it's not chaos, it looks like chaos. And one of the things that you must hang on to is that everyone must work to the same logic. You must be able to explain. We talked endlessly about that. We talked about it, and when our work as writers and illustrators and designers was handed over to the crew, that came up time and time again. The guy, everyone, you know, the Doof Warrior, he's very logical. Everything on his guitar is found objects. There's a hospital bedpan in the middle of it. Like everything else in the story has to have dual purpose. It's both the guitar and a flamethrower. And he is exactly the equivalent of the bagpipe player, the drummer, the bugler before there was amplified sound. So there is a logic to absolutely everything.
It comes through.
And sorry, one thing, just to make your point, that liberates, when everyone shares that logic, it liberates everybody to do what the hell they like. Paul Jaycock, a wonderful designer I've barely ever met, we said we needed Max's muzzle, the one he's wearing right now, and he put a garden fork on the front of his muzzle. I didn't do that. I didn't ask him to do that. But he said, well, I could found objects repurposed, garden fork.
Fantastic. Some quicker questions that have been publicly submitted before we move on to kind of, you guys have some questions for each other. George, when did Furiosa and Angharad agree on no unnecessary killing, and were there any other conditions they set?
Sorry, I missed the question.
When did Furiosa and Angharad agree on no unnecessary killing, and did they have any other conditions?
Yes, in my version of the backstory, she had to guard them because she was a woman when they were fertile. So they started to talk to her and really accuse her of being somebody in the service of a warlord. The advantage they had over her was that they were educated. If you see, there were books there. They had Miss Giddy. The Morton, to try to make them better breeders, wanted to feed their minds as well. Big mistake. So they read books and then they asked questions about the world. What happened to the trees? What happened to this and all that? And then they understand. And so, in a sense, and what's so impressive about Angharad is that she sees that the cycle of revenge, of killing on killing on killing, has to stop. So no unnecessary killing. They negotiated. Furio, as that wonderful character, the Keeper of the Seeds, Melissa Jaffa character, says, I've killed everyone else, everyone I've ever known out here, because that's the pragmatics of it. She says, back in the day when we had everything, there was no need to kill anybody. And so that was the kind of, Furiosa said there has to be killing. There's no way. We're warriors. There's war. Otherwise we'll go nowhere. And she said, well, no unnecessary.
Unnecessary is the caveat.
And so on and so on. They had to negotiate. I think their big thing was, you must do exactly as I say. Yeah. You have never experienced the Wasteland. So really, so you are going to have to do exactly as I say. No questions asked. Very military.
Nico, next question was for you. What kinds of things did Giddy teach the wives, Miss Giddy, the older character?
George talked about that, but she educated them, she politicised them. She's a history woman. She's a guardian of all the stories of all time that she can remember and has access to.
Yep. Yeah. And why does Toast know how to load guns and drive, was the other question I asked you.
Well, Toast has probably come out of the Wasteland. Some of the girls are born in there or have come straight from below from the Wretched. In her case, she came from the Wasteland. She was probably passing through and they were attacked. And so she already had some sort of experience of life in the Wasteland. And even as a child, you would be taught to defend yourself, to be able to drive a car. So that's probably where that came from.
That's Toast the Knowing, played by Zoe Kravitz, and Angharad the Splendid, played by Rosie Huntington Whiteley.
Right. And the last question along those lines was, why does Capable know what flamers and polecats are?
Well, again, Furio, they would have seen from their window, they can see, they would have heard stories. But Furiosa would have gone through everything extremely. She would have planned the escape. She would have told them everything they would need to know and what was going to happen. So they would be totally prepared.
And George, another question for you, very short. Can Furiosa read?
Can Furiosa read? Yes. Yes, because she grew up in the Green Place. Despite what Brendan says, the Green Place did once exist. It doesn't. No. Huh? The Green Place did.
I know. I didn't say it didn't.
No. You're just saying it didn't.
This
doesn't
going on
doesn't exist now.
That's right.
Sorry, I'm just having a joke at your expense.
Why you? I order.
No. She grew up as a little girl reading, taught by her mother, her many mothers. Yeah.
Brendan, you have a question for George about directing style and what you've noticed as a change or evolution.
Yeah, just when I saw Fury Road, I noticed one of the big things you've done since the Mad Max films is you got into computer animation, and brilliantly with Happy Feet, and doing a lot of CGI myself. One of the things is what you can do with the camera is totally different in a way with CGI now to live action stuff. And those great big camera sweeps in Happy Feet, where you can go from, really wide on an Arctic landscape and track right into the eye of a penguin or something in one move, because you can just do it with a computer. I started to see that in Fury Road, the big tracks over when they're all caught in the canyon, although you'd done it in Thunderdome, with the opening shot, the aerial shot down on the... But the shot, just the shot where they're all heading after... There's that great big aerial shot as you go over Immortan Joe's car, So I was just wondering if you feel that directing the animation has now sort of changed how you direct the live action.
I think I hope it has, because you hope that you're learning your craft as you keep going. And there are two influences on that observation. The first is triggered by, you notice I live my life by other people's quotes, and one of the quotes from Polanski was, there is only one perfect place for the camera at any given time. And it wasn't until we got into Happy Feet where you could take exactly the same performance, the same voice, the same movement, the same characters, everything, the same landscape, and just by changing where the camera was and the syntax of the cutting, you could change the scene significantly. And it made me really aware of the Polanski dictum that you really have to think about where is the perfect place for camera at any given moment. Now, when you're doing a live action movie, it's quite different than animation, because a live action movie, animation, you've got time to cerebrate and figure everything else, and it's an intellectual exercise more than it is ultimately an intuitive exercise, even though it's highly intuitive. But when you're shooting a movie, it's like a wildest game of football. You're right there on the field. You have no time to reflect what your next move is going to be. You just simply have to respond purely on intuition, right or wrong. And you're doing as much as you can in the moment of preparation beforehand to put the camera there. In terms of the sweeping shots, technologically, even if I had the wit to do them in the past, they weren't possible. Even 10 years ago, one of the benefits of the delay, we didn't have a wonderful thing called the edge arm, which is a big four-wheel drive with a big crane on it, and everything is remote. And you've got a brilliant driver, stunt driver. You've got a crane operator with toggle switches, a camera operator, tilt, pan, focus with toggle switches, and there you've got the director sitting there with a screen in front of him, and that camera can go in amongst all those chasers and swoop right out of the dust, inches off the ground, right up over the vehicle into the face of a character. And it can do it almost real time. It's like literally living in the middle of a video game. And couldn't do that 10 years ago. So both those things definitely came together. And until you actually mentioned it, I'd never really thought about it.
Nico, you have a question for George about does he run the movie in his head?
Yeah, I would come into the Mad Max room where we worked, and I would see George almost in a reverie, just kind of quiet, and I would walk around and you just completely focused somewhere internally. And I think I asked you a couple of times what that was, and I would like to know to what degree do you visualize the story or the movie in your head at different times? Do you actually visualize even edit points? Do you visualize the entire movie? Do you try to hold on to it? Is this part of your discipline?
When I speak to those actors, Hank Azaria is one, and Lee Perry is one here in Australia, who do all those voices. They can mimic voices absolutely perfectly. Both of them, who don't know each other, said to me, this is from the animation movies, said to me that until they were about 7 and 8, they did not realize that they thought that everybody could mimic anybody's voice. Now, these are two actors who can literally, I mean, Lee can mimic the Queen perfectly, can mimic me perfectly. You can pick anybody and do that, and the same with Hank Azaria. And a vaguely similar thing happened to me, where I've got to the point in my life, and I don't know where it happened, where, and I remember you said to me, Brendan, I know how you work. You conceive of scenes, the whole of a scene. You think in whole scenes. And until you said it, I wasn't even aware I was doing it. Now, I'm sure a lot of people do that if they had enough time to do it all their life. I've been doing it all my life. But I've got to the stage where I see whole scenes and they play out. And it's usually in unguarded moments. And why? I kept on pushing Fury Road away, never wanted to make the movie. And then I was a long flight from Los Angeles to Sydney over the Pacific one night. And in that dissociated, hypnagogic state, the movie played out in my head, not like on a screen, but in my head. And that's when I realized there was some sort of gravitational pull to this story. And I told Doug and everyone, I think we'll be making a Mad Max, and that was back in the day. And I think there's a kind of a Geiger counter that draws you to story. You feel the potential. You feel the energy radiating out of a scene. You see, there's real potential in there. Now, what I see in my head and what I finally get to see in reality could be completely different things, because reality always gets in the way. And that's when you get in the cutting room and you end up with the editor, Margaret, saying to me, whatever your intention was, that's not necessarily what's on the screen. We have to deal with what's on the screen. And so on. But there is that. And I saw that in you. I mean...
yeah, look, the spirit of what you did early on with the storyboards is almost, as I've said before, it's like, I didn't see it again until I saw the final edit. It's like they're perfect bookends to this process, this long process. The spirit of what was in the storyboards was the same spirit that was in that film.
Before you say that, I saw Brendan do something remarkable one day. We worked a lot on whiteboards. And Brendan had started to draw, and he worked from one corner like a scanner, and doing the shading and the outlines and everything. And he scanned the whole of the whiteboard, and a whole image came out with lighting, every detail. And I said to him, you do something that I've never seen before. You actually project, I think you project the image on the screen out of your head, and then you fill it in. I've never, ever seen that before.
Wow. We
were always taught to draw, the shapes, the form, get your compositions or whatever. And even, I was recently in Europe and seeing the work of the great masters, Rembrandt, Night Watch, the epic picture, which was, they x-rayed it. They found he was struggling as to the foreshortening of a sword, the handle of a sword. And he had about 5 attempts at it until he finally got it right. And somehow you don't do that. It was very interesting to me.
Yeah, well, sometimes you get your form because you've been drawing a lot, and you just sometimes get into the mode where it's just going really fast and really well, and then you know, next week you lose it. You know, that's sort of, you know, you can just...
But you were saying something, I don't know how our time's going, but you were saying something about how ideas lock in. They float around. What was that?
Well, that was in relation to, we were talking about the word furiosa. When I first met George and I came over here to sort of play around with the idea, George said, all right, don't tell anybody, but I've got two ideas for a title. One's Mad Max Fury Road or Mad Max Furiosa. I'm not quite sure which. I said, Mad Max Fury Road, that's it. He said, okay. And then this word Furiosa is a really great word. And it originally sort of, we thought, well, maybe Furiosa is the land that the Fury Road goes through, the Furiosa. And yeah, that'll do. And it kind of became a drift of that. And eventually, and it was when I left the project and I heard, you know, 5 years later, her name became Furiosa. And that's why the idea wouldn't attach itself to anything until it hit her, and that became her name. And it's so obvious when you see it now. You think, of course she's Furiosa. But we didn't see it. When we worked on the movie together, she was still called the Praetorian, the warrior woman,
The Imperator.
and the Imperator. One of those three we would use to describe her, but never Furiosa. So that's an interest. So we were just talking about how an idea, sometimes it won't attach itself properly to anything until it gets to the right place, and then it locks down. And in that case, it became her name. So that's how that came from.
Just a real quick thing, I didn't answer one thing. When a scene plays in your head or an idea comes along and it's good, you never forget it. It's because it's such a rare thing that it's really, really good. And I'm fortunate enough to be good friends with Guillermo del Toro, and I saw him. We had a lovely chat not a week and a half ago, and we were talking about this very thing. And we used to talk about keeping notes, and I'd keep endless notebooks. And then at the end of a project, I'd forgotten. I'd never look at them again, and I'd forgotten. And you realise no really good idea is ever forgotten. And he said, yes, that's exactly. I don't even look at my notebooks anymore.
This leads to the next kind of question that was submitted that I'd be really curious to hear the answer. Because obviously the film has been in development, or the first idea sketch 1997, it was released in 2015. To what extent is the movie that we all saw the same as what you originally envisioned way back at the beginning? Did advances in technology have any effect on what you wanted to show, or would the film have been the same if filming had gone as planned in the early 2000s?
I'll have to answer that. Everything is evolving, including cinema and film language, audience, and how we apprehend a film. It's changing. Like all cultural practice is evolving. And what's really interesting is that, just take, for instance, I'll take two things. One is camera. Back in the day of the early Mad Maxes, if we put a camera in jeopardy and it got smashed, that was $250,000 US. The budget of the film was $350,000 US. So you imagine how precious those cameras were. By the time we got to Fury Road, the main cameras, the Alexa cameras, are still very expensive. But we did a lot of the movie you saw on the Canon 5D. And if we smash one of those cameras, we could go to the airport in Namibia and buy one for $1,500.
Wow.
So that's very liberating. The other big thing was that you're basically getting it recording on a card. You're not churning celluloid. That's massive to budget. The card, once you download it, is still there. So the cameras were much more agile, and then in the digital with the digital dispensation, you could, this movie was shot over 138 days, but the story's only over 3 days. So we were able to keep the skies consistent by actually getting the sky of, a sky we liked from the first day and keep it going through that whole day. You couldn't do that. And just, the tire marks on the traffic, as you see the skid marks or the tire marks, you could always tell in the old days how many takes they would do by the number of skid marks on the road. And now you can just erase everything, take 1, 2, and 4 and keep take 3.
We've got about 15 minutes left, and I'll put some of the publicly submitted questions to you. George, one of the ones a lot of people, it came up in quite a few questions, was when are we going to see the Fable black and white silent edition of the film? Because the Blu-ray was sadly lacking.
I don't know. We're very, very keen to get it into this version, but we ran out of discs in order to do it. But the reason, and it's something that's just intrigued me for so long, but way back in the best version of Mad Max 2 was back when we were recording the score. And back in those days, to save money, they'd take the print and they would do a black and white / dupe. It was much, much cheaper to print. So they'd print the film in high contrast black and white, and you'd watch the composer, conductor with the orchestra, and they'd be watching it up on a big screen. And it was magnificent. That something about black and white abstracts the story even more. And so when we were doing the coloring and the DI, I spoke to Eric Whip and I said, would you just do a couple of scenes in black and white? Particularly the daylight scenes work brilliantly in a reduced palette like this in a very stark landscape. And it was definitely the best version. So what I wanted to do was to do the whole movie and just put the score, and you could watch it almost like a silent movie with score, or you could watch it without score and just with effects, and to see how it would read differently in each of those versions. And my hope is we have another chance at doing that.
It'd be fantastic to see. Another question that I was interested in as well that was publicly submitted, which was, do the events of Fury Road take place in a dystopian version of Australia or another real-world location, or is it all just an imaginary space in which it takes place?
For me, it's a hybrid of Australia and a post-apocalyptic world. The spiritual home of Mad Max is Broken Hill and parts of South Australia and so on. We were rained out of there. The studio, to its wonderful credit, waited for 18 months. It still didn't. It's the beautiful flower garden and the green of Broken Hill didn't go away, which is great for the landscape, but bad for Fury Road. So we ended up in Namibia where it never rains. But still in my mind, and I don't know if we've got that map. I think they might have that map that shows the landscape we drew, this one here. Yep. That kind of maps out from a bird's eye view the world. And that world, which includes the Citadel, Gastown, the Bullet Farm, a place we call the Buried City, and the green place that was once there, that to me is in the center of the Australian continent, a vast island continent. And it's now, to some degree, hermetically sealed. And so when they talk about the plains of silence and satellites that once sent stories back and forth, they have no idea of whether there are any more coastal cities, or are they just razed and the population gone effectively. They don't know. There's no, you just need enough gasoline to get across that unknown. So in this world, just to enforce, I guess, the allegory of it, the mythological nature of it, is a contained world, at least in my mind, and that world is the centre of Australia.
Well, speaking of this world, Nico, you unpacked this world and went a little deeper and wider based on George's stories with the comics. And you had some questions for Brendan, transitioning from screenwriting to comic scripting, about the use of time and how you choose what to leave in and out of imagery. And there was some interesting kind of conversations you were both having.
Yeah, I was interested in, well, Brendan asked me how it worked with comics, and I fortunately had Mark Sexton, who took me through the whole process. But I had a terrible difficulty with this thing of time, because I couldn't work out how to create change, and I had the problem of creating change within a single panel. And then Mark kind of talked to me about how the whole timing thing is different. Whereas in film it seemed to be much more causal. In a comic you can reflect. Your time, the time is your time, not you're not taken through it. You can look back at something, and you can. So it seemed that time was a crucial element in the difference between the comic and a film. And I wanted to ask Brendan what kind of choices he makes within storyboarding about what moments to choose within a narrative.
Well, with storyboarding, in the end, I'm working for a director, and the director's going to make the choice. But, you're going to talk about it. When it's a comic, I'm operating on a completely different art form and making different choices, about what experience I want to give the reader. So
it's not necessarily a narrative experience then?
It's a narrative experience, but I may not want to deal it out as if I'm representing a film in a comic. But when I'm storyboarding, I obviously am representing a film. So I must do it, certain compositional things, and, there's all that kind of stuff.
And so what moments do you choose to, like if you've got a scene, what moments do you choose to illustrate?
In a comic?
Yeah. No, in the storyboard. Could you, for example, have used more panels to tell the story, like 5,000 instead of 3,500? Or could you have told it in fewer?
You could, both ways. You could either do it fewer, and I have worked with some directors who they almost want keyframes rather than more analysis of the movement. You get some directors who actually want more analysis, and it would have been 5,000 frames. Right. But I think the balance we had on this one felt, like intuitively right. We weren't. Sometimes you get, for example, in comics, you often see with new people that are doing comics early in their career will spend too much time on movement, like somebody getting out of a chair might, they might do every movement, and you're thinking, crikey, this is going on a bit, So you've got to know when, like, what's the relevant thing? What's the bit you're after, and move on from it, if that's what you want to do. Yeah. If you've got a lot of dialogue, say something's got an internal dialogue going on about whatever it is, you may actually then drag out somebody getting out of a chair just to kind of carry the dialogue, So,
okay. Sure.
Yeah.
Did you say something about you choose the most dynamic moment?
We were talking about comic panels, and I'll either choose the most dramatic or the least dramatic, and in a way, anything in between.
Why the least dramatic?
Because I might want to convey...
It's like the silences between
silence,
words.
or I might want to convey, I'm not sure, or, stuff like that,
More nuanced in a way.
Yeah.
Cool.
The last question that was publicly submitted, George, which of the characters was hard to get right on the page, Is it hard getting character without resorting to dialogue? And which character arc was the most easily completed for Fury Road?
Which one was?
Which character arc was most easily completed for you?
To answer the last first, for me, the biggest character arc is Nux, because he goes from being a fanatic devotee of the Immortan, convinced that this is his day to die, historic on the Fury Road, and his disabused life, or the events disabuse him of his belief system, and then he has, and then being someone who has very little time, makes the choice to make the most of what he's got, and then basically relinquishes his own self-interest in the cause of a greater good. So that's a very obvious arc in that character. Furiosa, interestingly, and Charlize's performance is one that doesn't have a big character arc, because she's in many ways mysterious as we're getting to know her, and it's only when she is crushed by the events that we actually get to know her, and then Max has to give her hope. Max's story, Max was difficult because we don't have many words for him, but his arc is one of going from essentially a wild animal. He's behaving exactly like a trapped wild animal, literally trapped, and bit by bit, increment by increment, he actually acquires his language, his humanity, his ability to regard another positively, and ultimately to give of himself. And as Brendan points out, giving his own blood is, for another is a big moment.
Do you remember that scene where Max penetrates her with a knife and then gives his own blood? To me, was them consummating. This is these two, crazy warriors, and if you like, making love. Do you remember? I don't know if you remember saying, but you wanted that scene to be like a post-nuclear Gone with the Wind. Do you ever remember? Don't you remember that?
Great image.
And I think, to me, that scene absolutely paid off in that film, because everything's so held back all the time. Then finally, these two that you really want to come together in the craziest way possible, kind of consummate their relationship. And it was like, I was very moved by it, and I felt that was the point for me when Tom Hardy absolutely became Mad Max, really. At first, he's got muzzles on, he's, he's like that all the time, like a dog, And then finally, he's there, absolutely. And it came at the right moment. The whole thing, the Venn diagram, as you called it, absolutely came together in that point.
And that love story is so calibrated throughout, all in action. A look, or the handing of the telling of the kill switches, a point of trust, the giving of a rifle, another step forward in trust. So it's all there in action, from two people wanting to absolutely tear each other apart and kill each other, to wanting to what you say, consummating a relationship.
But the interesting thing about it's love in the agape sense. It's not love in the eros sense. It's love in the positive regard of another, and that's one of the big tricks with these movies is sharing out the dramatic real estate. You can't have the same arc for each character, and when you've got a number of characters, you try to give them arcs. You can't have Max do exactly what Nux did, or Furiosa do what O'Hara did, or so on and so on. That's one of the juggling acts as we thread this through. We talked a lot about that. I don't remember Gone with the Wind, but I probably said a lot of things I've forgotten.
Yeah. Well, Oh, okay. There's an actual concept art I did
Oh,
with Mad Max holding her like that.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
it's-
no, that. You mean the
and-
poster of Gone with the Wind, not the movie?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly,
that
yeah,
image.
Yeah, and that,
oh, yeah,
that
I
was
remember talking
informing
about
that scene when he holds her.
I remember that.
You know, it's the most crazy Gone with the Wind version you can think of.
Oh well, is that image they shot on the on the stage and Gone with the Wind, where the tall Clark Gable and the diminutive Vivian Leigh, he's over the top, and there's that red sky and that tree. And if you look at the optical, it's distorted, but it's still a striking image. It was always in the poster. Yeah. No. Okay. I'm with you.
And just before we wrap up, Brendan, you saw the film in its first form, sort of in the cinema with a public audience. Yeah. Your reaction to Max leaving the Citadel and Furiosa, it was wonderful to kind of hear. Can you talk a little bit about what you thought? Because the ending sort of happened after you'd gone, hadn't it?
Well, I mean, I guess I had a slight difference of opinion about... In the original version I wrote with George, he goes up on the platform with her because he's found her. And when I saw the film, I'd actually purposely kept away from looking at too much about the film because I wanted to experience it as if I hadn't seen it before. So I experienced it as a punter, paid my $10, here's Fury Road. And I thought, what the hell? I was really like... And I was kind of, honestly confused and annoyed and thought, what's he doing? Why is he going back out there? And then she's gone. There's, the platform wipes her away and then it's blackness. And I'm left with this feeling of, wow. And then the quote
was the
comes
love of
up
your life.
It was a strange feeling because, we had a chat about it the other day. Just... Because I totally expected him to be with her going up, he's going to take part in this new society, and then off he goes again.
But when in your long absence, Nico and I decided that Max hadn't earned the right to go there. It's only been 3 days, and he's not yet resolved at all. He's on the step to resolution. And somehow it would have been, we tried, but it would have been very cheesy had he gone up there and they lived happily ever after with the children. That
would
was
have
the
still
problem.
been a passenger on her journey.
But
he didn't deserve it. He did not deserve it. He's got a bit of work to do.
Thrash it out in the sequels. Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it here. It's been an absolute honour. Ladies and gentlemen, the co-writers of Fury Road.